Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual roundtable on minding the trust gap and implications of COVID-19 decisions. This program is being offered in partnership by ACUI and SCUP. Your membership dollars fund today's program and all of our efforts in this space, and we sincerely thank you for your support and for being with us today and every day. My name is Holly Stapleton, and I'm the Chief of Staff at the ACUI Home Office, and I will be serving as your technical director today. Oops. There we go. Today, we're joined by a really bright panel of professionals who bring a variety of perspectives to this conversation. But before I pass the program to today's moderator, I want to go over a few quick housekeeping points. These virtual roundtables are designed to be in conversation format as opposed to a traditional webinar. We see these programs as an opportunity for all to engage, connect, and really be an active part of programs. So please be ready and willing to offer your questions and insights along the way. Throughout the program, you can submit your questions using the Q&A button, which you can find on your Zoom menu. Again, please be sure to submit these as we go along. Feel comfortable doing so. As you enter these questions and comments, please know that all are viewable to all attendees and panelists. If a colleague submits a question that you would also like to be addressed, please be sure to upvote that question and we'll be sure to ask it live. The chat function is also available for you if you'd like to make a point or ask questions of other attendees. Another function that you have available to you is the raised hand function. If you can see us and hear us okay, I'm going to ask that you please raise your hand so that we know that everything is working on your end. Great. So I see some hands coming up. Thank you. All righty. So now I'm going to pass the virtual mic to today's moderator, Nick Santilli. Nick?
Thanks, Holly, and welcome everyone. We're very excited for today's panel. We have a great group of folks here and really interested in hearing their perspectives regarding the trust gap. And one of the things I'd like to do is open with this question. We state a trust gap in the title, but do you think there's a trust gap and how does it play out? So, Erin, would you like to begin with addressing this trust gap idea?
Sure. Thanks for having me here today, and thank you, Nick, for trying to corral all of us as we work through this enormous topic. What I think we're seeing for higher education is a spillover from a lack of trust in institutions generally, which has increased over a number of years. Anyone who's reading the Chronicle or Inside Higher Education in the morning has seen all of the many polls that have been fielded to try and get a better sense of what the trust gap looks like, who's with us and who's against us, to put it crudely. I've spent a lot of time at national meetings over the past year, in the before times when we could still travel, and frequently heard presidents with a great deal of frustration stand up in plenary sessions and concurrent sessions and say, I think it's just that we're not telling our story right. We're not telling our story well. And I would push back on that. I think it's deeper than that. I don't think it's just about communications and storytelling. I think it's about leadership and whether or not our families and students see their best interests at the very heart of what we're doing every day. And I think that's exacerbated as we all sort of watch Twitter throughout this week and see all of these institutions upending their professed plans for fall. I think we're likely exacerbating that gap, that we won't really have a good idea of what the depth and breadth of it is, I think, for a couple of weeks or months.
Thanks, Erin. Kevin, would you like to give us your point of view on the trust gap?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I echo many of Erin's sentiments. To answer your question very concretely, yes, I think that there is a trust gap, and I think the trust gap is intensifying. A colleague of mine who works with a very large national data set involving students informed me recently that looking at their data, students, by and large, are still very trusting when it comes to their institutions, with faculty and staff. So that's a positive note. On the other hand, I have spent a lot of time talking with higher education professionals and faculty, and I have to say that I don't recall ever being so inundated with people who are asking some very critical questions about their leaders, their supervisors, and wanting very much to be able to contribute to their institutions wanting to be able to fulfill the mission of the places where they're working, but feeling as if information is not reaching them, feeling as if the entire picture of the institution is not being revealed to everybody who ought to know, feeling as if they're being asked to do things that puts their own health and well-being at serious risk. And so for all of those reasons, I think that they are starting to really wonder if this is in fact the field that they want to stay in, if this is in fact the field that was pitched to them as being one that is humane and caring, one that cares about equity and justice. And so to add just one additional layer to this, I do also think that unfortunately, the decision-making process within higher education over these last few months is going to exacerbate a credibility problem within higher education. If it is the case that we want our institutions to be looked at as places where we advance truth, where we use data to inform our decision-making, to be places that American society can trust as epicenters of expertise, unfortunately, I think what has played out over the past couple of months undermines those efforts significantly.
Thank you. TJ.
Sure. Hey, thanks for having us here today. And I take a little bit from each of the buckets that both Aaron and Kevin have shared in terms of, I think from a marketing perspective, we have seen the field of marketing and communications really grow up and move away from spin. But I don't know that higher education has done the same. You know, I think we can all point to times when higher education institutions have communicated in a way that is a little bit coded or is a little bit reluctant to be fully truthful. And that doesn't align with the consumer experience of students, potential students, and even parents and families in the age of social media. The other piece I would take more from Kevin's bucket is what's happening, I think, generationally. He said students, by and large, trust their institution. I wonder about potential students, incoming students, and their families. And specifically what we know is that Generation Z tends to make decisions as it relates to brands, and institutions are brands, tends to make decisions about brands that share their values, right? So we've heard from young people that I'd rather buy a more expensive pair of socks from Bombas because I align with their value of donating one pair to somebody who's in need than I would to buy a lower cost. So it's less about cost, and it's almost always about return, ROI, and the ROI is inclusive of values. And what we're learning right now is what institutions value. Nobody's allowed to be value neutral anymore in today's world. People have to take some sort of stance, and their decisions are telling us what people's values are, not what people say, but what their actions are. And the metaphor that I made earlier this week on our podcast was about the sports leagues out there and what those sports leagues actions mean in terms of what they value. So the NBA says we value playing basketball. We think it's really important. We believe in it so much, we're going to take every precaution to do it and protect the safety of our players. The Major League Baseball said the exact same thing, but 3 games into the season, they're done. One created a really safe environment, and they prioritized player safety because it was important enough for them to do so to play basketball, and the other one didn't. And the question is, for your higher education institution, everybody's saying that they want to prioritize student safety and student health and the health of their faculty and staff. Watch what people are doing, and it'll tell you what they actually believe in and what's motivating their decisions. I think for some folks, it is about health, safety, and continuing the education of their students. I think for other folks, it's about the financial implications for the institution. And we're just getting to a place where people we were talking about this before we went live. There are people who have still not made decisions, and August is 2 days away. It's not that they don't know what they're going to do or need to do or want to do. It's they don't want to say it out loud because of the implications as it relates to enrollment. And that, not only is it creating a trust gap, I think this COVID accelerating all these things, it's emphasizing that trust gap in a tremendous way.
Great, thanks for those opening responses. And one of the things that I'm hearing, either directly or indirectly in all 3 of your comments is the state of higher ed leadership. And we've there's a lot of writing on leadership generally and higher ed leadership, and how do you prepare people to move into those roles? And thinking about, in those circumstances, how do you help people get to a place where if they aspire to these positions, that they have appropriate kinds of professional development to be able to lead effectively. in terms of thinking about the kinds of things that if you were to imagine a higher education leadership program and the kinds of things that individuals should focus on in that program, what might those be? I mean, it would seem to me that some type of preparation rather than just learn while you go kind of advice, it just not works. So what kinds of prep should individuals in leadership positions, either seek or take advantage of as they're moving along so that they can lead through these kinds of problems? And I've been trying to stay away from change management as a frame, because that means you're steady stating it. You might say change, but you're managing it. How do you lead through change? And this is that moment where leaders need to step forward and help the institutions change in ways to be able to thrive so students can be successful. TJ, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, lots of them. So I will say, so I'm going to reference the podcast I'm very fortunate to host often, only because each week I get to hang out with people that are much smarter than me, and their ideas have really helped inform some of my opinions on a lot of these things. So we had an episode where we had Brandon Busteed on from Kaplan, and Brandon is such a dynamic guy in terms of really helping to inform where higher ed might go in the future, work readiness, all those other fun things. And I asked this question about leadership in higher education because I think we have a leadership crisis in higher education. And I think two things really came out of that conversation. One is he said, dynamic leaders are going to make the difference. And so we tend to fall into a trap right now in this COVID period of saying these types of institutions are going to suffer and maybe close, and these types of institutions are going to thrive, and these institutions are actually going to survive this. In fact, Scott Galloway wrote a whole article about who's going to thrive and survive and perish, but he did it by institution type and a number of different metrics. And what it doesn't measure is dynamic leaders. And Michael Sorrell is a great example from Paul Quinn University. He went into an HBCU that essentially, I think if you'd asked him in his first year, he would have said, oh, my mission's to close this place down and get out of town. He went in and as a dynamic leader, turned the tide on that place in a tremendous way. And if you want to watch somebody lead through COVID, I think he's a great example of that. So the first part of my answer would be dynamic leadership. But I think there's a bigger thing at play here, and that's that there's a systemic issue that makes it challenging to be an effective and dynamic leader in higher education. There are only a handful of institutions whereby dynamic leadership is empowered to actually lead through change. And I think we have to take a look at our structures as it relates to boards of trustees. I think we have to take a look at our structures as it relates to tenure systems. I think we have to take a look at all of those other things that impact the ability of dynamic leadership to emerge and actually be effective in this world. Because the winners are going to be the ones who can pivot in a dynamic way and move quickly. And that has not been the hallmark of our field, right? We are a ship on the ocean. So I would hone in on being dynamic, but under the auspices of this greater issue of systemic challenges within the field.
Thanks. Kevin, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree very much with what TJ had to say. And I'll just add two things. Building upon this idea of a leadership crisis, I agree to some extent that we are in the midst of a leadership crisis and that we ought to be looking at some of the conditions that enable the type of leadership that we want to see. That said, I think one of the biggest issues over the past few months is not necessarily leaders making bad decisions. I think in some cases they're making necessary decisions that they feel are the right thing to do. The problem is that they are explaining the decision-making process very poorly. They are not doing enough justification for how they arrived at the decisions that they did, but are rather taking for granted the fact that people just believe that they are making the best decisions for the institution and the people who make them up. So the result is that people are hearing that we are going to do X, Y, and Z. Here's how we're going to do it. We're not getting enough of why. Why is it that we're doing it this way? What's the justification? What's the data that you're using to support this? Who are the stakeholders that you have consulted? And I think, unfortunately, too many leaders feel that they don't have to provide that type of explanation. And at this point, I just don't think that that's the case. And then the second thing that I would say on top of that is, unfortunately, the swirl of leadership is such that it's been very difficult for people to build up sufficient trust capital so that when they came into this crisis, they had developed the relationships that allowed them to be the dynamic leaders that they need to be right now. And even some leaders that have been doing this for a decently long enough period of time have not taken the time to build up trust among critical groups, including faculty and staff, so that they can make difficult decisions, they can take some risks, they are able to do some things without necessarily, to be able to do some things where they move quickly when they need to. All of those require that there is some existing reservoir of trust that has been built up over time. And unfortunately, I think many leaders were just drawing upon a very, very shallow pool of trust that they probably drew down in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic. Now we're entering fall and people are starting to really scrutinize them at every step. They just don't have the benefit of the doubt. Thanks.
Yeah, Aaron, and your thoughts?
As TJ said, so many, but a couple that I just want to bring to the surface. I think we are remiss if we don't spend some time looking at boards and their role in the search process. Board development, I think, is enormously overlooked in higher education, and AGB has great resources and programs available. But if a board isn't committed to constant development before it gets to a search process, it's not going to be in a good and healthy place to conduct a search process and find the right leader for the institution. I think we need to continue to normalize people coming from outside what we see as the traditional path to the presidency. I particularly am gratified to see colleagues from the advancement and student affairs parts of the campus rising into senior leadership and presidential positions. I think that's good for us. And lastly, I guess two last points I would make. One, we need our presidents to understand that vulnerability is not weakness, and that credibility is earned and not just handed over when you take the scepter and the mace and the office. And then lastly, I think we need to normalize not wanting to be a president or not being good at it. We see breathless coverage of presidents who flame out or fail or are shoved out of office. Some people try it, they don't enjoy it, they're not good at it, and I think we need to normalize stepping aside and saying, it's not for me. Instead of making this an enormous scandal and trying to find the underpinnings. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but it starts at the board level and it goes all the way through the institution.
Great, thank you. Really good thoughts here, and we have a few questions that have come in through our Q&A. Two of them have a similar theme. It's really, how do individuals are doing the frontline work? How do we get senior leaders to listen and act on the information we're providing to them? The day-to-day person who's answering the phone, working with families and students, feeling their frustration, empathizing with them and passing that information, on upward, and feeling like they're not being listened to. So how, might individuals and really the folks that I worry about in particular in this space are in the sort of the middle of the org chart. They have folks who report to them and they report to people above them, and they're getting it from both directions. So how, what kind of advice might you give to some individuals that are directors, for instance, or assistant deans, and others that are sort of in the middle of the institution on how to work both up and down in an environment like this? So Kevin, why don't you, give us your thoughts?
Sure, I've got a couple of quick thoughts just to get the ball rolling. With respect to this question of what should we say to our staff when we know that we're putting them at risk, and when higher ups don't really have a good sense of what's going on day to day, I think it's really, really important to recognize the risk, to be transparent and say, I have an understanding of what you're walking into. I don't agree with it. And to not just put on a smiling face. I think too often it's been the case that there's been kind of a Pollyanna effect across higher education broadly, where people are not at all levels being forthright with one another. And I think it's necessary that we do that. The other thing is, as a leader, make very clear to your staff, here are the ways in which I'm advocating for you. And it may not work. You may still, if you are part of this organization, be asked to do a job that you don't like, but I want you to know that I'm fighting for you as much as I can within my role. And then with respect to that second question that I saw, which was around just kind of helping higher ups to generally understand what's going on, and to be able to fight more effectively. As a faculty member, one thing that I want to provide in terms of advice is tenured faculty are one of the most important and powerful voices on a campus. And sometimes there's the belief that they don't care about the welfare of staff members. And in my experience, that's just not true. And staff senates and frontline workers at colleges and universities ought to partner with tenured faculty and use tenure as a way to push back against leadership, because that is what tenure allows us to be able to do. In my role as a tenured faculty member, I'm asking critical questions and pushing back. And the more that we can come together as groups with shared values and say, this is not the direction we want to go in, I think that'll be more effective.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Erin, your thoughts?
I echo Kevin's comments, and I think on a lot of campuses, staff governance falls by the wayside, partly because staff are so busy, but also because we just haven't inculcated the respect for this governance process on the staff side. And so to any staff member who is out there who is aware of a staff assembly on your campus that maybe has fallen fallow, I would highly encourage you to find some time to try and reinvigorate that organization. The best way for particularly mid and lower level staff to be heard is to be heard in a group. And that also offers some protection when you are in an organization with more senior level administrators and staff. I do think, and we discussed this before we went live briefly, I think the trust gap between administration and staff is growing exponentially. And I think we are in danger of losing an entire generation of staff who feel that they are being pushed too far, too hard, being asked to do things that they don't feel safe doing or don't think are the right thing for students in the institution, and are doing it all under reduced compensation, reduced benefit packages, while caring for children and families at home. And I think we are pushing staff to a breaking point. So I would encourage folks to really incorporate staff governance into the institutional culture and make sure that you have that seat at the table.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. TJ, your thoughts?
Yeah, for me, there's two sides to this coin. And first, I want to acknowledge and recognize that staff, particularly our frontline and often our sort of mid-manager group, are the least protected class of individuals on our campuses. You know, I acknowledge every day that I do not enjoy the benefits of academic freedom on my campus. And as such, I take a risk every time I say something that's unpopular in a public space, including my podcast, including social media, those types of places. But every day I have to ask myself about my values and where it makes sense to espouse those values. And so with that in mind and acknowledging that, and that something comes with that, what I would say is, you know, I was recently having a conversation with Clayton Mitchell from Jefferson, and he pointed to another systemic issue in higher education, which is that traditionally people haven't been rewarded for being those who fulfill orders. You know, that's this reward system within higher education, particularly for staff. You're asked to do something, you do it, you get rewarded for doing so. And what I would like to ask folks to do is, instead of being order fillers, particularly if they're orders that you struggle with, a strategy, and I've encouraged my staff to do this many times, is force people to say out loud why it is that they want to do the thing that they do, or what the value is that leads them. And oftentimes what I found is, if you force somebody to say it out loud, they will either realize it's not a smart value to lead with, or they're taking responsibility for the value rather than relegating that to you. The minute that you fulfill the order without asking the question, you take on responsibility for carrying that value out. And so if somebody says, hey, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, and you know that doesn't align with the value that everybody has espoused about protecting students, you can ask the question, hey, can you help me understand how this aligns with what we said we were going to do values-wise? And if somebody has to say it out loud, they may struggle with that, or at the very minimum, they have to take responsibility. The second piece of this, I think, is what you can do internally with yourself. And I was sharing this story before we went live. I had a conversation online with our hall staff today, and it's one of the first days of their training. And one of our hall staff said, you know, how do I, on move-in day, roll out of bed and help to do something that I don't believe in? I don't believe what we're doing is the right way to respond to this pandemic, and how am I supposed to reconcile that? And my answer was, it's okay to not believe in that thing, without espousing my own belief one way or the other on the conversation, but to say, what I would ask you to do is there any part of what you're going to do during move-in that you do believe in? As an example, you can either get out of bed that day, roll out to move in, and spend your day being very negative about the institution in a very public way, or you can say, you know what, I still fundamentally and foundationally believe in the role that I play in student development, and I'm going to take an opportunity to find the spots that I can do that throughout this process. I may not believe in the big picture, but I do believe in the impact and the leverage I can make on a daily basis in these interactions. I'm going to focus on those because that's a really good way for me to live my values in the bigger picture of this thing that I may or may not believe in. And I think that's a nice way to sort of stay true to your values and true to yourself as you navigate this world. But if you find yourself in positions to stop taking orders and really ask someone to espouse the why and take full responsibility for why they're doing things, I think that can help slowly turn the ship a little bit in the industry.
Great, thanks all of you. It's interesting because we had a question that came in on what does dynamic leadership look like, and I think in ways all three of you identified some of the characteristics of what dynamic leadership may look like. It's a matter of thinking about how you accompany your staff in the work that they do and support them and try to find ways to help them through the work that they're doing. I think still that the value and the importance of being a good listener is not discussed enough, and really authentic listening, not just the kind of superficial listening where you're nearly not hearing that person. And I think one of the things that was really interesting to me as well, in terms of listening to your comments, is how do you have governance and the governance environment? One of the things that I've been worried about is how will governance change on campus? Because some institutions have made some decisions, and Kevin, this goes back to one of the things that you were talking about, decision-making processes. And we were pressed, institutions were pressed in March, made some decisions that may have not followed their typical governance platform. I think one of the things that's really important is how now do you get back to following your traditional, or not traditional, but how do you follow your governance protocols? And what place now is governance, how has governance been changed as a consequence of COVID? And how does it contribute to perhaps either, widening the gap, or is this an opportunity to shrink the gap because it surfaced some things around how we do things on our campus, and perhaps maybe we need to do that a little bit better. So, Kevin, what do you think about some of the things around governance that you've noticed?
Yeah, I think there's 100% an opportunity for, as a consequence of being in crisis decision-making, for governance to get chucked out the window. And that is the last thing that we want to see happen. I think that proper governance is what allows us to get to good decisions. And I mean governance at all levels, not just at kind of higher up institutional levels. But so even those of you that are in kind of middle management positions, making sure that you have true pathways for input from staff to give you their ideas, to tell you when they are nervous or scared about something, and for you to actually listen to it. So what I have been saying all along is that we have had problems in higher education these last couple of months with trust, truth, transparency. But it is not too late for a leader to emphasize those things in their day-to-day work. So if you are truthful, forthright, honest, if you build up trust with the people that you are leading, you are transparent with them about the decision-making process and why you're doing what you're doing, then I think that we will arrive at a place where people feel heard, where the decisions are better, and that people, even if they don't agree with the direction, know why we're heading in the direction that we are. And so I'm a big believer in the value of shared governance, and I think it ought to include staff. It ought to include students and graduate students. Some of the campuses that I think have arrived at good decisions sooner, when I go back and I look at the committee compositions for their task forces and reopening plan committees, what's interesting is it's not just staffed by VPs and cabinet level individuals. It's staffed by it's the composition reflects the entirety of campus. They've got staff members all the way down the line. They've got live-in residence hall staff on these committees. And so there's individuals that can speak up and say, this is a bad idea. You all think that students are going to do X, Y, and Z. Well, guess what? I live with them, and I can tell you that that's wrong. And so there's where we see governance really playing, I think, a really important role.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Aaron, one of the things that you mentioned in your previous comments was how do you bring the board in? In terms of thinking about engaging the board in meaningful ways to be able to see sort of the full cycle or the ecosystem of governance on a campus, and thinking about what kinds of ways boards can act constructively in this kind of moment.
Yeah, I think this is a great opportunity for boards to, within the wheelhouse of their particular role in an institution, to really be engaged and involved and offering support to the president and the leadership team, while charging them to make the best decisions they think are necessary for the institution. I think if there's a strong relationship between the board and the president going into a crisis like COVID, you're going to have a much better outcome than, again, if you're trying to build this relationship in the midst of a global pandemic. And I think if the board and the president and the senior leadership team can agree on a set of principles that are going to guide the decisions that are going to be made, the board can then trust the president and her or his leadership team to go ahead and make those decisions based on the principles, and not hopefully feel the need to micromanage individual decisions. I think those principles are also really helpful grounding that build into what Kevin was talking about, that no one is going to like every decision that a leadership team makes. No one's going to be happy with it. But if we start at the beginning and say, we're going to tell you how we're thinking about this and what's going to guide our decisions, they at least can understand how you got to where you got. If the decision making happens in a black box and you suddenly present this to your community, of course there's going to be chaos. Which is why we're working with a lot of our clients and really encouraging them to think through, as we move into the fall semester, have you put in place now those metrics and triggers and thresholds so that in October or late September or early November, whenever it happens to be, when you need to make a hard decision about the remainder of your fall semester, your community may not be happy about it, but they're going to understand why you did it, because you've laid out for them this set of thresholds and triggers that are your red light, green light, yellow light indicators.
Great, thank you. So TJ, please answer this question regarding governance, but there's also another question in the queue really relating specifically to something you mentioned about your find a value you believe in, character, the notion. So, and the question there is really more pointed about why are we putting ResLife staff in particular to be the frontline workers?
Yep.
And how do we really live with that in a sense? So if you can go ahead and talk about governance and yep. the ResLife staff, who are you very close to?
Yeah. Well, I'll start one more time by acknowledging that oftentimes our frontline, our middle management, even up to director level folks at institutions, these are huge political machines. And oftentimes those are the folks that have the least amount of agency, they have the least amount of protection, and they have the most amount at risk and at stake. And the same is sort of emphasized in this COVID period. I was on a call earlier with a colleague where I say, who I'm worried about? Our housekeepers. I'm worried about our frontline housekeeping staff who have a number of different qualities as it relates to being vulnerable to this virus, who are in student spaces and in their most private of spaces, and who have the most at risk in terms of saying, I choose the value to not work. They can't do it. And so they're trapped in some respect. And I've even, probably a very unpopular thing to say, but on Twitter, I said, what's the over under on housekeepers we have to kill before we shut this down? Now, that's a really glib and tough way to say it. But at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is middle and frontline staff particularly are oftentimes in the worst space. And COVID is just emphasizing something that is a systemic issue in higher education. We are at an impasse in the field, not just with students, but with our staff as well. And so when I say identify value, I think it should be for everyone. And when I say identify a value, I guess what I'm really saying is what hills are you willing to risk things for? For me, the hill that I was willing to risk things for, willing to die on, was I'm willing to cash in all the credits to fight for a woman of color in my organization to make equal pay as somebody from the outside who was not a woman of color who we failed a search on. She was as qualified, but she was an internal candidate, and there were all these internal rules on her ability to make that pay grade. And I was willing to die on that hill because for me, that's a value that I held so close. That value, we say it in our mission that we're all about diversity and inclusion and treating people and honoring people and treating them with respect and paying them what they're worth to do their job. How am I to say that and not back that up? But that's my personal choice to die on that hill. And it's a hard question for many of our staff to answer is, which hills am I willing to die on? Because I think the risk analysis for them is so much higher. The risk profile is so much different. It is so much easier for me to say something in a way that may get me in trouble because I may have different options than some of our other staff. And I acknowledge that and recognize that. And so I know it's a tall order to ask somebody to find their value and stand on that value. But I think that we're in a place like no other in higher education. And I think that we're going to have more of those conversations. Now, you know, Aaron talked about young staff, or I think it was Aaron, about young staff and this potential that we could lose a whole generation of staff because of this trust gap. And I think that that's been accelerated by COVID to a place where that may happen more quickly than we suspected that it could in the past.
Great, thanks. Kevin, can you you wanted to also address this as well, and then also jump into this next question that's in the queue regarding long-term impact. In some ways, being in integrated planning, the work I do now, how do you plan through this pandemic to think about the future? So if you want to go ahead and start with your ResLife idea, and then move on to this next topic of long range, thinking about the long range future.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm intrigued by this question, and I'm gonna, I guess, phrase this in a somewhat controversial way, which is I would love to know from housing professionals and housing leaders the answer to this question. So as a somewhat outside observer, someone who is not affiliated with a housing department or housing unit right now, I'd love to know how they answer this question and what the honest response is. My fear is that the honest response raises some significant questions about the state of this field and what it means to be part of residents' life at a college or university today. And so this is obviously kind of a non-answer and more of kind of a pushing back of the question. But one way of thinking about this is in terms of long-term consequences, I kind of wonder if, to the extent that on-campus housing could differentiate itself from off-campus private housing, if that distinction is dissolving, and if COVID-19 is going to accelerate that dissolution so that people effectively don't look at on-campus housing as being particularly different than private off-campus providers, because it feels very much like I'm just dealing with a business. So I think one of the long-term consequences is that folks are going to be looking at on-campus housing and campus professionals very differently. And maybe this is something that's been happening for a long time and I just don't know. But that's one of the big questions that I have in terms of long-term consequences, is have we seen basically a full-scale privatization of on-campus housing? And at this point, is there no turning back?
I mean, I can comment on that from a housing lens that I think my answer would be yes and no. So I think to some extent over the past several years, really decade, we've seen an encroachment on campus. If you go back 20 years, private housing providers were really 3, 4, 5, 6 miles off campus. And there was a really big difference between an on-campus housing accommodation and off-campus housing accommodation. Over the last decade, particularly, they've really crept in. And if you look at the big providers of housing, the Landmarks of the world, Core Spaces, their key strategy is buy up real estate that is adjacent to campus, nearly on campus, build it up quickly, high-end amenities, high density so that you can monetize it very, very quickly. And what they've done is they've taken away the geography advantage that university housing has had for eternity. And so it used to be that every university housing complex was, generally speaking, closer to class. That's not necessarily the case anymore. You know, you can go to a college campus and see that the off-campus property is closer to the B school than the on-campus properties are in some respects. And so in that way, yes, I may support your theory that that students may start to look at as one big thing, just housing. On the other hand, I think COVID's really exposed something, and it's that university housing professionals have a different business model. And that business model is founded on student success. It is founded on caring for students and treating students in a certain way. And I don't know that anyone can name me an institution, particularly a public institution, that did not give students some sort of housing refund when they sent them home, or if they didn't fulfill the terms of the contract. Very few people can name me a private housing provider that did the same thing. And what it's done is it's created this customer weariness about the off-campus market being predatorial. Now, the off-campus market will say, hey, look, we have an obligation to house folks where they're home. And I think that there is something to that argument for some percentage of the population. But we have huge swaths of our students who paid 12 months of a lease, who lived in that lease for 8 months. And we have huge swaths of students who are sitting there going, you know, I just signed a lease for this off-campus property over the last couple of months, and it is July 30th, and we just saw 4 institutions change their mind on being online versus face-to-face. So I think we're seeing a push in both directions. I think more than anything, we might be seeing more differentiation between what university housing is and what it's not.
Thanks, TJ. Aaron, yeah, a couple of things. One is if you'd like to comment on this housing idea, but there is a question in the queue as well that I think is right in your wheelhouse regarding how are integrated marketing and communication staff pivoting in this particular kind of time. So that's one of the things in terms of helping leaders communicate better and how their work has changed in response as well.
Yeah, I would say we're less pivoting and more that like we're dancing on the head of a pin at this point. Everyone is relying on their communicators, and I'm seeing colleagues step up in ways that we never have been asked or needed to do before. A couple of things I'll point out just in terms of trends that we're seeing across the institutions we work with and others nationally is that a lot of leaders still think that communications is an acceptable substitute for leadership. We spend a lot of time talking to presidents and chancellors and rising professionals in the field and reminding them, I've got a PowerPoint slide that says it in big font, that communications is not an acceptable substitute for leadership. I can't communicate you out of a leadership void. You need to set the policy, make the decision, and then we can figure out how to communicate it. We definitely want to be at the table as professionals who can help advise leadership on potential pitfalls and how some of the staff or the students or the alumni are feeling. But we definitely can't make those decisions for leadership. We're seeing a lot of institutions as they need to shrink budgets, thinking about outsourcing our function, either communications or marketing or both, because they see that as something they can easily outsource and bring in a firm to help with, which I think is a worrisome trend for our campus colleagues. We are seeing video suddenly being the answer to everything. We have over-emailed our constituencies to the brink of insanity, and so now the new thing is video. Not a knock on video, but we really need to be thinking about how we communicate in a very holistic way. We're not going to catch everybody on one particular platform. So we need to be consistent and persistent. We need to make these very dense, very internecine procedures and processes that are necessary to come back to campus easy to understand. We need to make them visual where we can. And I like to quote something my dad always said to me, that you need to tell people, you need to tell them you told them, and then you need to tell them again. And they're still going to send you a nasty email that says, you never shared this with me. But like a lot of staff, our communicators are working beyond, above and beyond the call of duty. They're also, in addition to COVID, managing a lot of responses and a lot of social media pressure and a lot of advocacy around systemic racism and social unrest that is happening across our country. And so I know we don't want to get through this entire program without mentioning that, because that is, many would argue, and I think they're right, that is the pandemic and COVID is a symptom. So our communicators are on the brink, I think, of true and total burnout. And I would encourage all of the leadership teams and all of the senior folks on campuses to really take a moment to thank the communicators, because they are doing enormous work under an enormous pressure, and with very uncertain outcomes at this point.
Thanks, Erin. One of the things, we have a couple of questions in the queue that really speak to one of the things that was volatile, part of the volatile environment before COVID, and that is the questions around the business model for higher education. Now things have even been intensified more about the business model for higher education. So there are a couple of questions regarding, universities not being as reliant on auxiliaries like housing to fill budget gaps. And in terms of thinking about, what does a housing budget model look like? And, in terms of thinking about how these kinds of things become, reconfigured in a future business model for higher ed. And so I think really thinking about this, now, knowing that people were already talking about it prior to the pandemic. And again, the pandemic has intensified the pressure on the business model. And Erin, you're absolutely right. That was you anticipated one of my other questions, is that it's not the only thing we're dealing with right now. It's the powerful force of social justice. And how do we think about, returning to campus, really, thinking about these two really kind of ascendant issues with all of these other things trickling behind. If we remember, the enrollment cliff is still out there. That's what we were talking about in December. So, how does all of this kind of, fit in and thinking about us going forward? So, Kevin, I know that your particular area of expertise is budget, and finance. What are your thoughts about this business model problem that we have in higher education?
Yeah, I saw both of these questions, and I think they're excellent questions, and they're ones that I'm still grappling with. And so I'll offer a few perspectives, if not exactly answers, and eager to hear what others have to say as well. When the housing budget model is working as it should, and we've got people on campus and they are, paying for their rent as they normally would, then there isn't that big of an issue. But yes, I do think it's a problem that some universities have become very reliant on surplus revenue coming from housing to help fill budget gaps. And what that, in my opinion, has done is it has transformed the purpose of housing to some extent on campuses. And as a consequence of that transformation, it means that there are some decisions, I think, that for me are questionable. And it places, I think, our housing departments and staff in some difficult positions as well. And so in terms of a different budget model going forward, I don't know exactly what that would look like and what the full implications of it would be. But I think what we have learned as a consequence of this is that housing can represent a pretty significant liability when things don't go well. And so moving forward, one long-term conversation that I think needs to be had is what a different budget model could look like. And also, in the event that there may be more natural disasters, unfortunately, more pandemics, more problems like this, where coming to campus or staying on campus could be a problem. What does that mean for housing, and how do we limit or reduce the liability, financial liability to institutions? I think it's going to have to shape some of the decisions around the type of buildings that we pursue, the type of staffing that we use. And so yeah, not a lot of answers that I have, but very good questions that I think are conversations that we absolutely have to have.
Great, thanks. TJ, since it was really referencing housing, how do you think the model might need to be adjusted or altered in a way to really incorporate some of these ideas that came in through the questions?
Yeah, well, I think we're at the confluence of a number of different issues in higher education. I think it's much bigger than housing, and housing's a piece of the puzzle. Housing, what's been exposed about higher education and housing as a microcosm about this is we are an elephant of an industry. And when I say that, it refers to the metaphor, I forget which book it was in, but this metaphor of elephants versus cats in terms of companies. And if you drop a cat from 10 feet, it lands on its feet and walks away. If you drop an elephant from 10 feet, it probably dies. And we're a little bit of an elephant industry in that we're so fragile and so reliant on one specific input that there's no opportunity for us to pivot. Our entire industry is built on taking 18 to 24-year-old people and putting them together in high density. And the minute that something disrupted that, we were at a loss. And what it did was accelerate a lot of the financial challenges in higher ed. Clayton Christensen Institute put out an estimate that somewhere around 20% of higher education institutions could close due to financial reasons in the next 5 years. And there's not a lot of people disagreeing with that based on the way that institutions are positioned. But I think it is much, much bigger than housing. I had this conversation with a colleague of mine actually this morning. We talked about the fact that higher education cost has increased about 1,400% since 1990. Meanwhile, the per student funding, public funding of higher education has decreased when you adjust for inflation on a per student basis since 1990. So we've got those two things going on. Administration bloat is one thing that a lot of people pin it on. I think there is a little bit of that. We had a good conversation about technology. You know, I'm old enough to remember when technology was the promise of optimal efficiency in higher education. Yet I look around and I see that we have a lot of technology staff. We have a lot of high price enterprise systems, but we also have the exact same staffing pattern, if not more staff in all the other areas at the same time. So I don't know that we fulfilled that dream of technology being the great equalizer in terms of efficiency and cost. So the financial model in higher ed has been broken for a long time, and it's come to bear. And I'll sum this up by saying part of it, again, is systemic. You know, as an example, if we as institutions believe in holistically educating our students under, let's say, a liberal arts model where we believe in the humanities and those types of things, things like an RCM funding model undermine that tremendously, right? So systemically, we're saying if you make money, you survive. If you don't make money, you don't survive. Forget what our values are about what programs our students ought to be engaged in to be holistically educated and work ready when they walk out of here. Meanwhile, the data from Gallup tells us that nobody thinks students graduate in work readiness except for provosts. And corporations are spending millions of dollars annually to educate students after we've educated them. So we're missing an opportunity with the entire funding model. We're missing an opportunity for corporate partnership and corporate dollars. They're already spending them in post-graduation. We're missing opportunities to lead with our values and build funding models around that. And RCM is just one example of that. So I think it's one big broken thing with potentially good intentions behind it that we've got to take a step back and kind of fix. What I challenge my staff to do all the time, and I wish more institutions and leaders could do this, is say, if we didn't have an institution at all, and I were to reimagine what an institution would look like today to serve students today, what would it look like? And then work backwards from that. Unfortunately, we start from what are we today and how can we make steps? And we put the hurdles up before we ever take those steps. And so we don't know what that future vision is going to look like.
Right, great, thanks. Aaron, any thoughts about the business model question? And then I have just a final question as we're approaching about 5 minutes left together.
Sure. I think TJ is absolutely right. And at the risk of belaboring the point, COVID hitting higher education isn't the problem. Higher education had the problem long before COVID showed up, and it shows us how very vulnerable the industry is, and particular subsets of institutions within the industry. The small liberal arts college, they were limping previously, and now it is. It's going to be a very, very frightening year, I think, for the small tuition-dependent liberal arts college, which breaks my heart because that's where I started my career and where I was educated, and I believe very deeply in that approach. But TJ is absolutely right. There are all of these sacred cows that we simply can't touch because it's not how we do it. It's not how we've done it. We are resistant to change, and we are convinced that if we just tweak around the edges, we can change our fate. And I think COVID has showed us that that is absolutely magical thinking, that we need to think very hard about how we reconfigure higher education in a very real way. And it might not be MOOCs and stackable credentials and badges, but it's got to be something. There needs to be an appreciation of more of a diversity within higher education. Yes, the small liberal arts college is a valuable approach. Yes, the urban metropolitan regional institution is a valid approach, but we need to remove some of these barriers that just keep putting us back in the same spot. And every time we land here, we are absolutely stunned to be back in the same exact position again. At some point, this is the trust gap, right? People have told us over and over and over again, you charge too much. I'm not sure there's value. My kid's not ready to go to work. My employees need to be reskilled once they get here. And we keep saying, but we just need to tell our story better. It needs to be more profound than that. It needs to go deeper than that. And we need to be ready to make some really hard choices.
I also might argue, to add on to that, that differentiation will be important in higher education moving forward. We have been exposed as the ultimate follower industry, right? So I always joke that my parents did me a great disservice in preparing me for higher education, because whenever I made a bad decision, I would say, but so-and-so did it. And they would say, well, so-and-so jumped off a bridge, would you do it? And I'd have to say, no, I have to think independently, right? Now, every meeting I walk into, they go, well, what's institution X doing? Right? I was not prepared for this. I was prepared to think independently, and we are a follower industry. We look at what other institutions do. We never want to be the first, and we always want to kind of hang out and follow that trend. It feels a little bit safer. And what we've ended up with is a big bell curve of higher education institutions with a whole lot of people in the middle that are aiming for the same 18 to 24-year-olds that all have a college of education, that all have a certain program. There's so many programs that look identical right now, and there is a shrinking, as you mentioned, the enrollment cliff, there's a shrinking group of people to take advantage of that. And so I think part of that's going to be differentiation moving forward, being what you're going to be. What I love is that the community college model, because they don't have auxiliary revenue they depend on by and large, they don't have a lot of tenured faculty members to deal with sort of the slowness of decision making and pivoting. They're really well positioned right now to offer a high ROI on something that's very, very relevant. And it's interesting to see how they may enter the conversation moving forward because of what they represent in terms of differentiation to the traditional college student.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, both of you have answered already the question I was going to ask. So Kevin, I'll go ahead and give you the floor to have a last comment. Really, my question was, what do you think going forward will be the kinds of things that institutions should be doing to ensure, really provide an environment for student success and for institutional thriving?
That's a great question, and it's a big question. So let me see if I can answer it in a quick way. I have appreciated so much the other panelists talking about the importance of values and principles in our decision making. I really think that there is still an opportunity for colleges and universities to think seriously about their contribution to society and the public good, and to make decisions that very clearly and concretely demonstrate that contribution. And if all we are doing in the higher education field is making decisions that are good for institutions, and not making decisions that are good for our communities and good for society, then we are going to lose people. They are going to lose trust in us. And so what I'd like to see moving forward for higher education to thrive is a recommitment to our contributions to society. One very easy way we can do that is to make sure that we are not opening up our institutions in ways that spread COVID-19.
Great, thanks so much. So Holly, I'd like to turn it back to you as we close.
Great, thanks Nick and our panelists today. Before we end, we want to do a quick plug for our YouTube channel, which is where this recording will live. We will also share it with SCUF so they can add to their channel and offer it to those members who may have missed the program. We also want to thank all people in the audience. Thank you for being here. We do a lot of these programs. It's always great to have many voices, many opinions, and also to our panelists again. On behalf of ACUI and SCUF, we look forward to seeing you soon in the virtual space. Take good care.